Welcome again to our study in the Scriptures. We're dealing with the subject of polygyny. Does the Scripture condemn it, or does the Scripture permit it and allow it? This time we're going to be looking at the case of Jacob, who I call the accidental polygynist. We all know that Jacob had 4 wives. There was Rachel and Leah, and then there were the 2 handmaidens that he got. When people deal with this man Jacob, who of course was also named Israel, and it is from him that Israel got its name, people who don't like polygyny find that they must deal with him and do, as we said before, rehabilitate the witness. That's a case of where the witness goes against your case, and so what you do is try to find a way to make him acceptable. The arguments against polygyny with regard to the story of Jacob, number one, they point out, as I mentioned a moment ago, that Jacob never intended to be a polygynist. Well, that's true with regard to his first 2 wives, but he never objected to the addition of wives 3 and 4, the concubines. He was tricked with regard to Leah, but if he understood polygyny to be an immoral infraction of some Edenic ideal, he sure didn't let it stop him from taking Rachel and the others thereafter. It's also argued that Jacob returned to monogamy. As I had mentioned before, this is sort of a litany of the anti-polygynists as they deal with these people. Yes, they went into polygyny, but look, isn't it to their favor that at the end of their lives they gave polygyny up and returned again to the Edenic ideal? In this particular case, it is said that Jacob did that after he had his spiritual renewal at the Jabbok River. That's the place where he wrestled with the angel. And it said that after that, he never refers to anyone but Rachel as his wife, nor does the biblical narrator. What do we make of that argument? Well, I make of it that it's utter manipulation of the text based upon the sacred doctrine that silence is clearer than statement. In fact, it's a case of post hoc reasoning. After this came this, therefore this is the cause of it. In point of fact, it is the biblical narrator who calls the women wives prior to the experience at the Jabbok. We find that in Genesis 31:17. Why would God call them wives if he never accepted them as wives? And it's possible that they're also referred to as wives after that in Genesis 33:35, insofar as the term that is employed in that latter text is Isha. It's used of them all. And that constitutes, and that's the same word that's translated wives. That word can be translated either women or wives. Are we to believe that God changed his mind about what constitutes a real wife to Jacob? He'll call them real wives at this point, and then later on he'll call them not, some of them not real wives. And would he deny them their right to be called real wives simply by not saying that they were real wives? This is a lot of inference, a lot of things added into the text to try and get it to say this. No one denies that Leah was a real wife. In fact, she was Jacob's first wife. There was a consummated marriage, yet she was not referred to as a wife after the Jabbok experience either. This is really just a case of reading silence into a historical narrative, and it's simply not a right thing to do. Remember, too, that when Esau asked who the people were with Jacob, remember after the Jabbok, Jacob met Esau, his brother, whom he had run away with after taking his birthright and getting the blessing. He was afraid that he was going to get killed by him. That's why he beat it out of town and went up to Paddan Aram and got these wives. And now he was coming back, and he was deathly afraid that Esau was going to hear that he was coming back and was going to go after him and kill him, as he had threatened to do before Jacob left. When Esau met him, he had strung out some of the wives here, and they keep showing up, and he says, "Who are these people?" Esau says, "Who are these people?" And Jacob simply said, "They are the children whom God has given me." They, of course, were the children and the wives The children were children to the maidservants as well as to Leah and Rachel. But he simply lumps them together and says they are the children that God has given me. Should we assume from that that Jacob had returned to a single life because he didn't mention any wives at that point? The argument that we see here about a return to monogamy is really nothing more than, once again, wishful thinking and an argument from silence. Another argument that is given by people dealing with him, Davidson offers in his book, in page 16, he says the Jacob narrative bristles with the details of the disastrous consequences of polygamy in Jacob's family. The strife and discord between Rachel and Leah are meticulously documented in Genesis 30:1 through 16. The dispositions of jealousy, revenge, short temper, and lack of control on the part of Jacob's children, that would be later on in the Genesis account where all the kids gang up on Joseph, seems to mirror, he says, the dysfunctional nature of the polygynous home life. And he cites several passages in Genesis to establish his point. What is this argument? Well, this is another case that we mentioned before and told you to look out for of selective sampling or cherry picking. What of the strife and discord in Adam and Eve's family? There is the blame game that Adam and Eve practiced when they were confronted by God. As for the listed problems with Jacob's children, they seem more closely to mirror those of Adam's children, Cain and Abel, and that was a monogamous family. But be it far from Davidson and company to point out the same problems in a monogamous family. The strife and discord, note, between Rachel and Leah were limited to Rachel's sorrow over being barren, which the text tells us God caused. So did God set them up for that jealousy? No, jealousy is a human problem that Rachel had. Instead of trusting in God, she became jealous of her sister Leah, who was very fertile. The strife and discord between Rachel and Leah were limited to that particular problem. And notice that after Rachel got a child, Joseph, there is never any mention after that there was a problem between her and her sister, nor was there any problem between them when they got married. So all we're doing is lifting one incident in one period of time out of the life of Jacob and his wives, and we're blowing that up so that we can bring it against polygyny. There was also, in that story of Jacob, some hogging of the husband. That's to be acknowledged. But we should remember that this wasn't necessarily the fault of Rachel or polygyny per se. It was the problem that he had been fooled in this sort of thing. And again, it's not, once again, not related sufficiently to what is called necessary and sufficient cause. Yes, they needed to be plural wives before they could be jealous with each other, and yet at the same time, that didn't mean that they had to be jealous over the particular situation. In the ancient world, being barren was a reproach. I think of Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1, where it talks about 7 women laying a hold of a man, and they say to him, "Look, we'll provide our food and our clothing if you will take away our reproach." And the notes of the translators at that point will tell you that the reproach they were talking about was being single, not having any children. So you could be in a monogamous family and be barren, and your neighbor could have the same attitude about you that we find in this family, but we don't argue against society in a case like that. We only apparently get to use that if the jealousy is in a polygynous family. A fourth way of dealing with it is to point out that Jacob was preferential to Rachel, and that must have hurt Leah terribly. Well, you know, preferences in human relationships are there for a number of reasons. Not all of them are unjustified. Think of it this way. For one thing, remember that Leah was a party to deceiving Jacob into consummating a marriage with her. Wouldn't you be a little ticked if somebody pulled one like that on you? If he is the accidental polygynist, she has some responsibility for it, and incidentally, probably Rachel did too. Since Rachel, surely if this would have excluded her morally from being a wife to Jacob, would have tried to find some way to notify him that he was going to be deceived. So I would have to say that I can understand to a certain degree Jacob's feelings toward Leah. He was bitter because he had been deceived, and it cost him a lot of time working on the bride price for the second bride. You know, talking about 7 years here. So that's a considerable strike against her, and I can understand why he'd feel a little negative. And it's a little hard at times to be positive and romantic with somebody who has done you dirt like that, as my mother would have said. Secondly, remember that that Isaac favored Esau in that monogamous family, while Rebekah favored Jacob. Should we reject plural children in monogamous marriages because of that? No, we don't do that. Well, here we go with cherry picking again. We don't want to draw the same conclusions with regard to monogamous families that we are quick to do with regard to polygynous ones. Thirdly, the women interpreted their children as gifts from God, and we see that also that Jacob himself, when he approached Esau, said, "These are the children which God has given me." Indeed, if you read the very text that he cited before to show that there were all these problems in the family, that's the same text where it says that God himself blessed these different women with the children. He is the one who opened their wombs. Rachel, she blamed Jacob for her barrenness. There isn't any way of knowing at all whether if she had been his only wife that she wouldn't have been angry with him because she was barren if there had been no other wives and no other children. So this kind of argument is simply inferring from the text something that need not be inferred, because you've got a presupposition going in your mind that surely the cause of the problems here is nothing more than polygyny itself. Why is it that Davidson and company don't make much of God's involvement in the battle of the babies, as the text does? Isn't it because they've donned their dark glasses and they can't see the light? My conclusion about the Jacob cycle is that it is extremely interesting and offers numerous lessons to be learned about living in a family. But to conclude that all was evil and full of implied condemnation is not a fair analysis of the text. If it were all that bad, why didn't God stop Jacob from bedding Leah in the first place and grant children right away to Rachel? Why should God allow a man through whom the 12 tribes of Israel were to come to wholesale go into polygyny without a single word, trying to help him keep from this apparently gross sin? If he would stop Abimelech from falling into adultery with Sarai, wouldn't he stop Jacob from falling into the sin of adultery with Leah? The Jacob cycle is no real help, as far as I'm concerned, to those who oppose polygyny.